Earlier in the course, you learned about ngFor, which is one of the built-in directives in Angular that we use for rendering lists. In this section, we're going to look at ngFor in more detail. We're also going to look at the other built-in directives, including ngIf, ngSwitchCase, ngClass, and ngStyle. And finally, we'll wrap up this section by looking at building custom directives in Angular. So let's get started. There are times that you may want to show or hide part of a page depending on some condition. So here in app component, I'm going to define a field, courses, set it to an array with 2 items. Now for now, we're just going to use simple numbers. In a real world application, you're going to have the actual course objects. But let's not worry about that and just focus on showing or hiding part of a page. Now, in our app.component.html file, if we have any courses in this array, we want to render them in a list. Otherwise, we want to display a message to the user like there are no courses yet. So first, I'm going to create a div. This is where we're going to display the list of courses. Now here, again, I'm simplifying this example. If you want to render the list of courses, you would use a UL and LI with the ngFor directive. So here's one div for displaying the list of courses. And here's another for displaying a message like no courses yet. We want to render one div or the other depending on the number of items in our courses array. For that, we use the ngIf directive. So to refresh your memory, we use directives to modify the DOM. Now there are 2 types of directives. Structural directives modify the structure of the DOM by adding or removing DOM elements. Attribute directives modify the attributes of DOM elements. So here we want to change or modify the structure of our DOM. We want to add or remove one DOM element. So whenever you're using structural directives, you need to prefix them with an asterisk. And I'm going to explain the reason later in this section. So asterisk ngIf. Now here we add the condition. If this condition evaluates to truthy, this div will be rendered in the DOM. So we can add something like courses that length greater than 0. Now you don't necessarily have to write the condition here. You may have a method in your class like this. Do we have any courses? When we call this method, we get some value. If that value evaluates to truthy, then this div will be rendered. Now let's revert this back. Now we can use the same technique with the other div. And this is the old approach before Angular 4. So let's see how that works. ngIf, I want to render this div if we don't have any courses. So courses that length equals 0. Now back in the browser. So because we have 2 items in our array, we see the list of courses message. Now back in our component, I'm going to empty this array, save, back in the browser. Now we get no courses yet message. Let's inspect this. So here under app root, look, we have only one div, which is the div with the message no courses yet. So the other div is not in the DOM. And that's what I want you to pay attention to. So when you use ngIf, if this condition evaluates to truthy, this element will be added to the DOM. Otherwise, it will be removed from the DOM. Now in Angular 4, now we have a slightly different syntax to implement the exact same feature. So instead of repeating ngIf twice with this condition reversed, we can implement it using an if and else kind of approach, just like how we have if and else in a lot of programming languages. So first we need to change the type of this second element from div to ngTemplate. So ng-template. Then we remove this ngIf, make the code cleaner, but we need to assign this template an identifier. Earlier, you learned that you can use this hashtag to define a template variable. Let's call this block no courses. Then we modify our ngIf. So after the condition, we add a semicolon and we type else and then the name of our template variable, no courses. Note that I didn't add this hashtag here, just the name of our template variable. So if this condition is truthy, this block will be rendered. otherwise the other block. Let's try it. Back in the browser. So currently we don't have any courses, and that's why we see this message. If I go back in app component and add a couple of items here, now we see the list of courses. Now you may not quite like this syntax because in the first block we're using a div, in the second block we're using ngTemplate. They're kind of inconsistent. There is another approach. So we can define another ngTemplate here, ngTemplate, and this is for displaying the list of courses. So we assign it an identifier like courses list, and here we add that message, list of courses. Okay, now we have one div with two templates, one for the condition that is truthy and the other for condition that is falsy. Okay, now we need to change our ngIf. So first we add our condition. If this condition is truthy, we add then, and here we specify the name of our ngTemplate. So courses list. And then we have else, and here's the other block. So note that we have a semicolon after the condition. Then we have then as a keyword. Here is the name of our target block or target template. After that, we have else as a keyword, and finally the name of the other template. I personally prefer this approach because it's more clear and more consistent. Now there is another approach to show or hide part of a page, and that's what I'm going to show you in the next lecture. Now back in the same example, let me show you another way to show or hide part of a page. Instead of using the ngIf directive, we can use the hidden attribute. So in HTML, we can apply this hidden attribute to our divs to hide them. Now if you go back in the browser, we should see no courses yet message. Here's the message, beautiful. Now this attribute in HTML also exists as a property in our DOM objects. So we can use property binding and bind this property of the underlying DOM object to some expression. For example, here I want to hide this first div if we don't have any courses. So courses.length equals 0. Now similarly, we can hide the second div if we have at least one course. So courses.length greater than 0. Now back in the app component, currently we have two items here. Let's see if application is working properly. So we get the list of courses, beautiful. Now back in app component, I'm going to empty this array, save, and back in the browser, no courses yet. Beautiful. Now let me show you something. Let's inspect this element. Note that both divs exist in our DOM, but the first div has the hidden attribute, and that's why it's hidden. So that's the main difference between using ngIf and the hidden property. When we use ngIf on an element, if the condition evaluates to falsy, that element is removed from the DOM. Whereas when we use the hidden attribute, the element is in the DOM, it's just hidden. So you might ask, which approach is better? Well, if you're working with a large tree with a lot of children, it's better to use ngIf because these elements can take substantial memory and computing resources. You don't want to put them in the DOM if you're not going to show them to the user. Plus, Angular may continue to check for changes even to invisible properties. So the change detection mechanism in Angular, that's the mechanism that keeps your views in sync with your components, that's running in the background. And when these elements are in the DOM, Angular continues to perform change tracking on these elements. So in these situations, if you're dealing with a large tree with a lot of DOM objects, it's better to use ngIf to free up resources. There is just one exception. In some situations, building a large element tree in the right state may be costly. So if you have a page with an element subtree, in that case, ngIf may have a negative impact on the performance of that page. So if the user is going to click a button to toggle something to show or hide that part of the page, if building that element tree is costly, you shouldn't use ngIf. It's better to keep it in the DOM and hide it using the hidden attribute. So in summary, if you're dealing with a small tree of objects, it doesn't matter which approach you choose, it's purely your personal preference. If you're working with a large tree, first check to see if building that tree is going to be costly or not. If it's costly, use the hidden property to keep it in the DOM but hide it. Otherwise, it's better to use ngIf to remove it from the DOM and free up the resources. In Angular, we have another directive called ngSwitchCase, which is very similar to the concept of switch case we have in a lot of programming languages. So imagine we want to build a page to display properties on a map or in a list. So here we have two tabs, map view and list view. When we select the list view, we see the list view content. And when we select the map view, we see map view content. So let me show you how to implement this with ngSwitchCase. And by the way, you can implement the exact same thing with ngIf, but ngIf works only if you have a truthy and a falsy condition. In this case, we might have multiple tabs, so we cannot implement that using ngIf, and that's why we need ngSwitchCase. So in app component.html, I want to add some basic markup to render bootstrap tabs. So here we want a UL, and this UL should have two classes. So we add .nav and also .nav-pills. This syntax you see here is what we call Zen coding, and with this we can quickly generate HTML markup. So tab, now we have a UL with these two classes. Now inside this UL we want an li, and inside this li we want an anchor. Now we want two of these elements, so I put them in parentheses times 2. Tab, and this is what we get. Now let me temporarily make the first li active. So I apply the active class here and name this map view. The second li, the anchor, should be called list view. Now below that we'll have a div, and here we'll have either the content of the map view, so map view content, or list view content. Now I want to temporarily comment this out because one content div will be rendered dynamically. Now let's just make sure that our markup is working. Back in the browser. All right, it looks good, beautiful. Now let's move on and make this dynamic. So let's go to our app component. Here we need to define a field to keep track of the currently selected tab. We can call this view mode, and we can set this initially to map, and then we can change this to list. So it can hold one of these two values, map or list. Now back in our template, let's bring this div back. We want to render one of these divs dynamically based on the value of view mode field. So on this top parent div, we're going to apply property binding. So Angular adds a new property to our DOM elements that is not part of the standard DOM. This property is called ngSwitch. We can use property binding, ngSwitch, and bind this to a field in our class, like view mode. Now, on each div, we'll apply ngSwitchCase directive. And because with this directive, we add or remove a DOM element, this is a structural directive, and we should prefix it with an asterisk. So ngSwitchCase. Now, if the value of view mode is map, so map as a string, note that I put map in single quotes. Let me zoom in. So we have double quotes, which is for the value of this directive, and we have single quotes, which is for the map as a string. Okay. Now, similarly, for the other div, I'm going to apply ngSwitchCase. We want to render this div if the value of view mode is list. Now, optionally, we can have another div. So if the value of view mode is something else, I want to render this div. So here we add ngSwitch default, and it doesn't have a value. We apply it like an attribute, okay? So let's add some label here, otherwise, right? So this is how we use the ngSwitch directive. Now finally, we want to make this class active dynamic. So we can use class binding. We put it in square brackets, class.active, and we want to render this if view mode is set to map. So we can write a simple conditional statement here. View mode equals map. Okay? And similarly for the other li, I'm going to add another class binding, class.active. We set this if view mode equals list. Now finally, when we click these links here, we want to change the view mode. So let's remove this href attribute. We use event binding and bind the click event to an expression. Now here we can simply call a method in our class like change view mode and simply pass a string like map. But that method is going to be a one-liner. So we can simply write that expression here. So we simply set view mode to map. Okay? And I'm going to copy this and apply it to the other link as well. But this time I'm going to change this value to list. All right, now let's test the application. So back in the browser, initially the map view is visible because we set the view mode to map in our component. If we click list, we go to the list view and back to the map view. Now back in the component, I'm going to change this value to something else. With this other div that we applied ngSwitch default directive to, this one should be rendered. So look, we get the otherwise message here. So here's the lesson. If you want to compare the value of a field or a property against multiple values, use the ngSwitchCase directive. All right, you have seen the ngFor directive before. We use this directive to render a list of objects. So let's review this one more time, and this time I'm going to show you more details about this directive. So here in app component, I'm going to define a new field called courses and set this to an array of objects. In this array, we're going to have 3 course objects. And for each course, we're going to have 2 properties. One is ID and the other is the name. So course 1. Now I'm going to duplicate this. So ID 2 and 3, and obviously course 2 and course 3. Now let's use the ngFor directive to render these on the view. So app.component.html, we want to have a UL, and inside this UL, we need an li tab. That's the markup. Now we add ngFor, and here as the value, we type let course of courses. And then we can use interpolation to render the name of each course. So course.name. Let's make sure the application works up to this point. So back in the browser, okay, we got 3 courses on the screen. Beautiful. Now this ngFor directive exports a bunch of values that might help you build certain features. For example, imagine you want to render a table and you want to highlight the first row, or maybe you want to highlight the last row, or you want to highlight the odd or even rows, or maybe you want to display an index next to each object. We can use the exported values from ngFor directive. So here after this expression, we add semicolon. One of these exported values is index. So we type index. Now we need to alias this to a local variable. So we type as, and then the name of our local variable, like I. So with this expression, we get the value of the index and put it in a local variable called I. And then we can use interpolation to render I on the screen. So like this, I. All right, now let's test this. Back in the browser, look, before each course, we have its index in our courses field. So as you can see, the index of the first item or the first course is 0. Now, index is one of these exported values. There are several other. Let me show you how you can find the list of all these exported values. So if you head over to angular.io, in the search box, you can search for ngFor of directive. That's the name of our directive. Even though in HTML we use ngFor, but the actual name of this directive is ngFor of. And you can see that here, it has a D icon, which indicates a directive. Now on this page, if you scroll down, under local variables, you can see all these exported values. So you saw index, we also have first, last, even, and odd. So let me show you one more example. Let's say we want to render a table and we want to highlight all the even rows. So we can get access to the even value and alias this as a local variable, is even. Because this even is a Boolean, unlike the index, which is a number, even, odd, first, and last values, they are all Boolean. Now here, next to each course, I want to render a span. And I want to render this only if this is an even row. So ngIf is even. For now, I just add a simple label. Now in your applications, you might want to render a table. So you can use this variable is even and apply some style or some class to even rows in your table. Now let's try this. Back in the browser. So you can see in front of the first and the third rows, we have this label, even. All right, now let me show you how this ngFor directive responds to the changes in the component state. So on the top, I want to add a button. With this button, we want to add a new course in our list. So here we can handle the click event and bind this to a method called onAdd. Okay, now back in the component, let's add this new method here. So onAdd. We call this .courses.push, and we push a new object here, ID, for, and name is going to be course 4. Save, back in the browser. So here we have 3 courses. When I click the add button, we get a new course here. So Angular has this change detection mechanism. So whenever you click a button, or whenever an AJAX request or a timer function completes, Angular performs its change detection. It looks at our component. It knows that this courses field now has a new object. That's the course with ID 4. So then it will render that course using this template. Now similarly, we can add a button next to each course to remove it. So button, remove. And here we can handle the click event and bind this to this expression. We're going to call onRemove method in our class. And as an argument, we can pass this course object that we have in each iteration. That is the course object here. Okay. Now back in the component. So similarly, I'm going to add another method. onRemove. Here we get a course object. Now to remove this from an array, first we need to find the index of this course in the array. So this courses dot index of this course object. We get the index, and then we call this dot courses dot splice. So we go to that index and delete one object. Let's try it. So back in the browser. Now if I click this remove button, course number 2 will be removed. There you go. So once again, after the execution of this onRemove method, Angular performed its change detection. It realized that one of the objects in our courses array is no longer there. So it removed the corresponding list item in the DOM. Now similarly, if we modify an existing object, again, Angular will refresh the DOM automatically. So let's change the name of this method from onRemove to onChange. Back in the component, rename it here. Now, instead of removing this course from the array, I'm simply going to change its name. Update it, like that. Let's test the application. We forgot to change the label, it doesn't matter. So when we click this, the name of the course changes. Again, this is change detection in action. In the next lecture, we're going to look at this change detection from a performance point of view.
Hi, thank you for watching my Angular tutorial. If you enjoyed this video, please like it and share it with others. Also, you can subscribe to my channel for free new videos every week. This video is part of my complete Angular course with almost 30 hours of high quality content where you will learn everything about Angular from the basic to the advanced topics, all in one course, so you don't have to jump from one tutorial to another. In case you're interested, you can get this course with a big discount using the link in the video description. And if not, that's perfectly fine. Continue watching as the next section is coming up.